Good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you, even though I'm not able to physically be present today. Um, but it's such an important topic that I gladly am willing to provide you with some input for this important colloquium. Um, and I'd like to especially thank Simon Heath for making this possible. Um, I'd like to speak to you for about maybe 30 minutes about using the Sustainable Development Goals as a catalyst for redesigning higher education, especially agricultural and life science education, in what we call nowadays the Anthropocene, the geological epoch in which one single species seems to be influencing major global ecosystems in ways that will alter the future of the planet forever, the Anthropocene. Let me just give a brief outline. First, I would talk a bit about what we call global systemic dysfunction, and science in the post-truth era, where there are alternative facts, where we do not know exactly how to act, and we disagree sometimes about what is going on with our planet. How do we deal with that in education? The SDGs as a catalyst for reorienting, redesigning, teaching, learning, and capacity building. What might be some competencies or abilities that we need to be able to sustain life on the planet as we know it? That includes Homo sapiens as one of the species still. And finally, the major part of this talk will be about what are the implications for education and science. Um, we all know, and I'm sure you do too, that there is plenty of evidence that something is happening to our planet, varying from the mass extinction of species, as we can see in this picture here, the sixth time that this is happening on the planet. But this time it is one species that can be held responsible for this happening. We all know about the toxification of water, air, oceans that is ongoing and is becoming a major issue in today's world. We know obviously about climate change, COP21, the world trying to keep the rising of temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius. And we know that there is agreement by and large in the scientific community and increasingly in the policy community, but still there are dissenting voices that have access to media, social media, and can influence public opinion in a very powerful way, leading sometimes to confusion and even inaction, which can be highly problematic. How to deal with socio-scientific disputes in education and in science is becoming a critical issue, especially because some of the doubt that is created is sometimes manufactured. There are interests in our world that may not have long-term perspectives in mind, but rather short-term perspectives, short-term gain, maximization of profit, and not so much optimization of people, planet, and prosperity. And when this doubt is manufactured, intentionally created, it can leave a lot of citizens confused, and that, as I said before, can lead to inaction and a delay of responding in a good way. This is maybe compounded when engineering, science is contributing unwillingly, perhaps, to this doubt and uncertainty around the issues that affect our planet at the moment. The plant bottle is a nice example of an attempt by engineers to create plastics that are more environmentally friendly. As you can see in this picture, up to 30% plant-based, which sounds great, but from a legal point of view could also be 1% or 2 or 3. 100% recyclable also sounds wonderful, but in reality this is less than 5% that is being recycled. Most of it is either incinerated, ends up in landfills, or falls into smaller pieces, ending up in our waterways and oceans. So it sounds good from a marketing point of view, but whether it really leads to any change in the way we relate to our environment remains to be seen. Also, the name plant bottle can be very confusing. Obviously, people who may not understand the science behind such a bottle might think that actually you might as well throw it away in nature or wherever, and perhaps next year a plant might grow out of that bottle. It can be confusing. So how we frame things influences also how we think about things and how we act in response. The confusion is sometimes further compounded by attempts to help consumers make choices about what they eat. Here there are some examples of logos that all suggest a more ecologically or environmentally or socially just or better way to catch fish. And there's so many logos that people might be they don't know what to choose anymore. What logos can we trust? And this lack of trust in science can also lead to a delay of action and a kind of a laissez-faire response of, as long as we do not have the truth, as long as scientists disagree, as long as there's confusion, why should I change my life? And this can be highly problematic because the issues that we are talking about are extremely urgent and do not have a lot of time. One other thing or trend in society that further complicates this is the commodification of virtually everything, of land, of water, of air, even of education, where students become input, throughput, output, where we try to measure and quantify performance, where we want to rank performance, where we are cultivating values of competition, of individual success, building your own portfolio, working on your CV, always having to grow personally, otherwise you fall behind. And this kind of a mindset is kind of a treadmill that demands that we always continuously develop. And in some ways we need to question that kind of a mindset if we want to live more lightly and more sustainably on the planet. So the commodification of everything, in order to continuously innovate and grow, it has become almost part of our DNA, but might be part of the problem and not part of the solution. So critical thinking is becoming more and more important if we are to address the sustainability challenges of our time. A final, perhaps, trend that we also need to be aware of is that we are very much connected to our electronic devices. Young people, but also people of my generation, spend sometimes 60, 70, 80% of their waking hours looking at an electronic device, whether it's a tablet, a laptop, or a smartphone. And some say this connects people and is therefore good for exchange, interaction, but there's also evidence that it leads to a disconnect between people and their physical environments, people no longer identifying with their local environment and therefore less likely to care for that local environment. And it can lead to what they call psychic numbing, where we can no longer concentrate, think deeply, read a book for that matter, because we're always thinking about that little voice that is in our pocket, the WhatsApp ding sound that demands immediate attention, that may provide something that gives instant gratification, but at the same time makes it very difficult for us to think through these kinds of complicated, even wicked questions that we need to address. So as E.O. Wilson says, we have access to the internet, the World Wide Web, to Google, to Wikipedia. Information is everywhere, but wisdom is hard to find. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom, as he put it so eloquently. So how do we break through this? How do we develop mindsets that can lead to a better connection between people and planet, that allow us to deal with complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty in ways that begin to address this global systemic dysfunction. So to quickly summarize, we live in unusual times with very complex problems, even wicked. There's a lot of confusion, ambiguity. There's the extinction of truth, if you will, a lack of trust in science and government, hyperconnectivity through our electronic devices, which can lead to the erosion of meaning, short attention span, loss of sense of place, and rapid spreading of what we might call viral nonsense. Then there are the dominant neoliberal economic forces that accelerate inequity and material values, and that normalize and in a way breathe unsustainability. Living unsustainably is made easy, living sustainably is made hard. Unsustainability has become the default, and we must somehow disrupt that. So, one critical element of responding is this notion of continuous learning. We must recognize that there are no final or definitive answers to these kinds of questions, but we must continuously look for a better way of doing things, and sometimes we must look for doing better things altogether. Now we all work in university contexts where innovation is very important, where we're always looking to do things better and to optimize systems that we have developed. But we also spend a lot of our brain power on maybe futile research that can help maybe companies or private sector interest expand market share or come up with new products for which there may not be a demand, but a demand can be created. And the question is whether that is the role of public education and research. And as George Monbiot puts it in the Guardian not so long ago, we're interested in, is there water on Mars, and is there intelligent life out there in the universe? But, as he says, is there intelligent life on Earth? If we look at what is going on our own planet and how we are destroying ecosystems, and how we are creating cultures of inequity. So, as he says, while we marvel at NASA's discoveries, we destroy our irreplaceable natural resources. So we can buy pre-peeled bananas and design smartphones for dogs. And this is an important question. Is this what we should be doing as public education institutes? Now, let me talk about the Sustainable Development Goals that are also central in this colloquium here in Zagreb. We all know there are 17. I won't get into all of them. That's already been discussed at the meeting. But I want to point out that of these 17 goals, there are 2 that you can see as mechanisms that can help realize the other 15. Number 4, quality of education. And number 17, creating partnerships between science and society, between the world of governance, the world of business, the world of education, the world of research and civil society. And these 2 mechanisms is what I'm interested in, and I think you are as well as educators, in how can we create spaces for interaction, spaces for learning, for capacity building, that can develop the kinds of qualities, competencies people need to function well in a responsible and responsive way on this changing planet. The others all cover some content area, and there's some, I think they are generally accepted as valuable, although you could question them, you could critique them, you could say number 8, decent work and economic growth. It does not question the notion of continuous growth. You can even see in the symbol we must always go up, and maybe you could argue that it is also about living in harmony, in balance, and sometimes it's expansion, and sometimes it may be shrinking and even decay. If you look at the seasons, it's not always springtime. There's also summer, winter, fall, and it is the same in the cycle of life. And we tend to focus on growth, continuous growth, and some argue that maybe this notion of continuous development is part of the problem, and maybe sustainability should be an alternative to development. So we could critique them. Number one, no poverty, everybody will agree, but if you would make number one, let's eradicate extreme wealth, there would be a lot of opposition, even though that might be far more effective in reducing poverty, if you want to really make impact. So these goals, and especially these two mechanisms, education and partnerships, point at some key areas for sustainability science and education, and they are connected. First, we must understand change, complexity, and transitions much better. Oftentimes, boundary crossing, systems thinking, connectivism, having a more relational way of living is critical. How do we develop that? Building agency and transformative capacity, not just raising awareness and understanding, but also providing students, citizens, with the opportunity to make change in their own lives and maybe in the lives of others. And the structures that force us to live in particular ways. Utilizing diversity, living with uncertainty and dissonance, not seeing them as a problem, but seeing them as an opportunity to think more deeply about wicked sustainability challenges. So not to tame it or manage it, but to learn to live with it in a generative way. And finally, also important at this colloquium, how to deal with values, ethics, and moral issues, and socio-scientific disputes. Very briefly, I'll run through some of these. Understanding change, complexity, and transitions. Generally, you can say, well, there are different ways to respond to a problem, an environmental or an ecological or sustainability or a health-related problem. You could look at it from a technological vantage point or from a more societal vantage point, or you could try to look at it from both. And you could look at existing systems that we have created and try to optimize them, including external cost, for instance, paying the fair price for our food by also including the damage done to ecosystems would be one way to optimize our current system. Or you could also look at the values and the assumptions and the principles that are underneath these systems and begin to question them. So in the first case, we're optimizing existing systems. In the second, where we say, okay, the systems in themselves are fine, but we need to make sure that they function better. And in the other case, we're actually beginning to question the system, and we're saying maybe we should be doing better things altogether. That would be the transition perspective. To make that more applied, if you look at, for instance, food security and food and nutrition security, you could say, okay, we can optimize the existing systems, and then we can feed the world by, for instance, increasing food literacy so that people make better and healthier choices, improving resource efficiency, minimizing post-harvest losses or consumer waste of food. Then we don't really need to change our systems much, we just need to optimize it. And a more radical technological view would be, no, to feed the world, it is really important that we come up with new genetic engineering technologies like genetically modified organisms. We need a blue revolution on oceans, use the oceans far better in providing food. We need to close cycles, and then we start transitioning from a more technological point of view. And from a more societal perspective, you could say, well, no, it's really about creating a circular economy or developing alternatives to protein, a shift away from meat to maybe to insects. That requires a shift in mindset in many parts of the world. Or it's all about food justice, a better distribution, a more equitable distribution. of food. That would solve a lot of problems. 2 billion people overweight in the world, 1 billion people malnourished, or having a lack of calories, or maybe not the right calories. And a more integrative transition perspective would really not just looking at food, but then you look at water, energy, climate. You look at redesigning cities and urban spaces to create environments that breathe sustainability. That would be an integrated transition perspective. And making students aware of these different perspectives is critical. Boundary crossing, seeing connections. This picture I use a lot because it really, in a very quick way, shows what we're talking about. We have developed an education system that is really conditioning us and teaching us to think in boxes, categories, disciplines. And as a result, we find it very difficult to see connections and relationships. We need to be able to do both. We need that engineering mindset, but we also need that ability to think holistically. We're not born as people who reduce the world into small pieces. We are born as the world, and we see the world unfold in front of us holistically, where we see connections and relationships almost in a natural way. But as we spend more time in schools and university, we kind of unlearn that. And we need to relearn that. And we need to build that into our schools and universities, that we can approach issues from different vantage points, and that we start seeing these connections again. We need to think the world whole again, and our education needs to provide for that. This is just a very quick example of how you could do this, just having one bag of tea in the middle and looking at all the aspects, inputs, throughputs, outputs, that relate to that from an energy point of view, from a waste point of view, from a social justice point of view. The whole sustainability puzzle can be found in the dissection of that one tea bag and looking at all the links between that. So how do you facilitate responsible and responsive education? If you want to do that holistically, you need to look at the content of what we teach. We need to look at new emerging topics. Are they there? Resilience, disruption, alternative forms of development, closed cycle design, cradle to cradle, place and identity. Where is it in our curriculum and how can we build it in? We need to look at the research side and the professional development. Do we also look at alternative forms of knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge? How can we work with that? Citizen science, engaging with citizens in doing research, becoming more reflexive in our teaching and learning. The links between the university and society. Are we working on issues that are really out there in the community, or are we only working on issues that are commissioned by those who can afford to pay for it and have maybe a business interest? Probably that will be needed too, but not at the expense of the other dimension, the societal dimension. How do you develop those relationships? Then we also need to look at our own practices. If we don't walk the talk, if we talk about sustainability, if we talk about energy renewal, alternative energy, if we talk about food justice, if we talk about fair food, and if we talk about biodiversity, restoration, what do we do in our own university grounds? Do we mimic those practices, or do we completely separate them? And is there a disconnect between what we think and what we do? How can we bridge the gap between thinking and doing and become more believable and consistent in what we do in our university? And finally, we also need to rethink our teaching. We cannot just lecture and have, even if we improve our lectures by making it more into TED Talks, which is of course better than a traditional standard lecture, we do need to think about taking students outside, doing experiential learning, looking at social learning with other actors in society together, utilizing diversity between them in a good way, managing conflict in a good way. Also looking at values and ethics in our teaching and learning, How do we address that? Then there's building agency and transformative capacity. I already said earlier, it's not just about knowing and understanding, develop the cognitive part of our brains. It's also about emotional, passionate, committed engagement in these issues. And building agency refers to building empowerment, moving away from this notion that we cannot change the world, that we are stuck in these structures, that what we do doesn't matter because we're just one individual, to a mindset that allows us to believe that we can make a difference in our own personal lives, in the lives of our family and communities, but even in the lives of people far away. Citizen science, I mentioned it already, is one way of actively engaging people in real research and engaging them in taking action and monitoring if that action has an effect. Creating the feedback is critical for motivating people. So to move out of this spiral of powerlessness, where we believe that there's a lack of goods in the world and a lack of goodness, and I won't get into this spiral, we don't have the time for that, but you will get the slides as well. After the colloquium, you can have another look at this, to the spiral of empowerment, where people are beginning to see that there are plenty of goods and goodness, where we do not have to compete all the time, where we can collaborate, where we can have a shared economy that is still innovative, because we do need to be able to respond to changes, of course, but that doesn't go at the expense of others or at the expense of the future of the Earth. A word on ethics. This is often an ignored part in education, because a lot of teachers are uncomfortable dealing with values and ethics. But reflecting on how what we do, how our lives and the lives we live affect the lives of others far away, using the cell phone here as an example, how is our cell phone connected with people dismantling old electronic devices in parts of the world where very young people are exposed to the toxicity that comes with taking these devices apart. Looking at the ethics of people working in clothing factories, whether it's in Bangladesh or in other parts of the world, at the circumstances in which they work, or the mines that the precious metals come from, how people work in those mines, how the community, local community benefits or suffers from those mines. When we have a cell phone, should we be aware of that, what those ethical consequences are, and how can we bring that into our teaching and learning in a way that we cannot just feel depressed and hopeless as a result of it, and it becomes a traumatic experience to use your phone or to eat your meal. That's not going to be very fruitful, but in a critical way, where we start considering alternatives, whether that's a fair phone or another type of use of phone, we don't know, but we need to make explicit the values that we have and bring to the classroom. We need to confront them with other values, and we need to be engaging in a dialogue that can help us to co-create values that are more sustainable and more mindful of other species and of the future generations. Then I think education can be critical in working on this. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. Let me close with a few words on competencies and abilities. In English language, this works nicely. Sustain abilities. What kinds of abilities are we talking about then, considering these areas that I discussed? First, we need to know more about the dynamics, the meaning, and the content of sustainability. Some kind of literacy will be needed. Learning to know will remain important. Then the critical dimension, asking those difficult, uncomfortable, disorienting questions that make us think more deeply. Questioning the routines and the structures that we have come so accustomed to, but can be highly problematic. Disrupting even those systems, learning to critique is important. Then the change and innovation dimension, learning to make change, unlocking creativity, creating social cohesion between people who are not like-minded and have different values. How do you utilize these differences between people in a good way? And how can you begin to act on what you learn? And how can you learn from acting, reflecting on what you do? Learning by doing, obviously, is not new to you, but needs to become part of mainstream education. And finally, the existential or normative dimension of sustainability, connecting people, places, and other species. Post-human ways of thinking are becoming important, but we don't know much about it. Taking a moral position, considering ethics, learning to be, but also learning to care. We need to pay much more attention to that in our universities. Finally, to summarize, education and science for planet and people. Look for boundary crossing opportunities between science and society. Adopt a systems approach. Linking with the SDGs can help with that. Utilize diversity and multiple perspectives. Looking for synergies, but also for contestation and conflict. It is often at the edges of where different groups or systems meet, where there's energy, where something is happening, where you need to really learn to do well at these boundaries. Move beyond increasing awareness and understanding to also have that possibility to make change and to become empowered. Ask what is it that we are strengthening by what we research, what we do, what we investigate in society, and what are we weakening? What are we silencing? And maybe what we are silencing may hold the key towards a more sustainable world. And finally, science for societal impact, not just for impact factors and journals, will ultimately save the Earth. So we need to really think about science for societal impact and move away maybe, or at least supplement science for impact factors and journals with a more public-oriented university. Universities tend to be public institutions. That requires that they are not an extension of the globalizing economy, but they are there to serve people and planet. And then a school or university can be created where the ethos, the whole culture is working towards sustainability. And that might look a little bit like this. I already discussed this, but I want to end with a reference to the Global Education Monitor Report published by UNESCO, the 2016 report, 570 pages, but it has abstracts that are very powerful in 5 or 6 different languages, freely downloadable on the UNESCO website. It's on education for people and planet, creating sustainable futures for all. I find it a very valuable resource for educators, especially at universities, so I recommend that you get a hold of that. Thank you for listening. I hope you will have some conversation amongst yourself after this input talk. Again, it's a pity I cannot be there in person. I would have loved to see how this introduction leaves you. Hopefully it leads to some dialogue amongst yourselves, and I wish you a wonderful colloquium, and hopefully next time I can be there in person to have that conversation that I would like to have. Thank you.